Right, here we go again. I was working on this scene. It's a seascape in Kerry. It's Ross-based Strand. And my phone ran out of space. So I'm setting up the next stage now. So basically what I have done here, I just have to get around sideways to do this, is I hope that hasn't moved out too much. I'm working on the sea, and I've mixed up some ultramarine and some viridian, and it is the viridian, although it's quite lucid, it actually is a very pure green. So it actually works very well as an underneath layer. So I'm giving some brushfuls of colour along here. Leave a little bit of white space. There's a whole mountain range that goes in there that I'm waiting for the sky to dry, so I'm getting on with the next stage. So I'm careful to leave little bits of white, even in places that there aren't any white horses, because it actually does need, you need to exaggerate the light on the water to make it actually look like water. And where I have painted, when I paint back into that, that's called wet in wet. So what I'm going to do now is, I've got some dried paint on my brush. My palette needs to be cleaned. I'm going to use some very strong turquoise now, just because I see a glint of it in the water up there. The thing about watercolours is it actually dries a lot paler. You have to make allowance for this when you're actually doing the painting. So the sea sweeps around. It's actually much lighter here. This will be a mixture of waves breaking on the shore and it'll have some deep sea green colours in there, and also lots of white. And there'll also be a little bit of a shimmer from the sand. So there'll be a few browns and greens as well. And so, as I said before, I tend to exaggerate these just a touch because it will dry actually a lot paler. Probably got a bit too green there. If I go overboard, I'll just lift a little bit out. So the brown that I like to use is actually, it's called Venetian red. It's a very earthy red brown. And just put it in there. You can see that's it, almost pure. But it does make a lovely organic dark if it's mixed with blue. Now I'm actually going off screen where you are. So I'll just let that merge and blend, and then I have a little bit of greenery up here because there's a little the sand dunes run into the grassy bank up here, so it's catching the sun there, so that's quite bright. And then there's some rocks too. So I'm just going to use the brush on its side. I've sort of squeezed out the water, as you can see. I've got a cloth beside me and I just press it in. You see, it's that dry that it actually holds the shape, but this is actually enough to have paint on, and I can spread some paint around with leaving some little white speckles coming through. With watercolour, you're working from light to dark. Your whites and your lights are really important to keep. So you can always go back and darken them later on, but to begin with you just need to keep them pretty light. Now this is the shaded area of the dunes, so I'm going to put some dark greens in there. And as you can see, that's very softly going in there. That's actually painting into the wet. So I wait. Normally I work on dry. I put the paint onto dry, and then I paint back into it, and that's what gives me a wet and wet effect. Okay, so that's probably enough for the first stage. Now, if I were to if I wanted more highlights in the sea, some of these wet areas here, I can just paint in some clear water, and the water pushes the paint aside, the paint that's already on here. So if I wanted some definition, perhaps with some waves, I could actually do that. But it's always better to leave the small detail till last. So it's almost like if you know there's going to be a highlight there, just put in the highlight, or even lift some colour out and leave it. But don't be tempted to do too much at this stage, because what you want is lovely broad areas of unspoilt washes, whether they're wet and wet, whether they are working on the dry. You want to keep that freshness in the watercolour. So I'll let this dry, and then I shall come back and I'll do a few more of the mountains and the definition on the horizon, but it has to dry first.